So you can see them in the purple, and don't miss the one in Brandleshome in Bury, right at the top of the screen. So they also have different funding. Trinity and Islington is the emergency active travel funding that came in under COVID-19. Levenshulme Active Neighbourhood is the Manchester Challenge Fund, which is the largest source of active travel funding within Greater Manchester. Garside Hay Road is again the Emergency Active Travel Fund, and Cheadle Heath, which is the only one of these that hasn't been implemented, and it was in the proposal stages when we were doing the research, is part of an Arab Sustrans project of, I think it's 10 active neighbourhoods across the region. So the broader project had lots of different methods. So we were looking at social media and using scraping methods with Twitter, but we also had to use it for our participant recruitment as well. Walkalongs were one of our methods, especially with the residents of active neighbourhoods. These were just really nice methods, partly because they enabled us to do the research in person if that's what participants wanted. We also did them online, and we could be socially distanced, but also because we were walking around active neighbourhoods or proposed active neighbourhoods, it was a nice way for the infrastructures or proposed infrastructures and what was there already to stimulate the conversations. But what we did see was, in particular, older people were underrepresented because we had to use kind of online methods in our recruitment. So we engaged with different organisations that were working with older people on using online methods to have kind of tea mornings and different events. So we joined those, and we did other different discussions with key informants like public health people, and had an active neighbourhood working group of people that were implementing active neighbourhoods. So with our walk-along participants, it was really interesting. So when we were talking, we could broadly categorise our 23 walk-along participants to whether they were supportive of active neighbourhoods, unsupportive or ambivalent towards them. But actually, whilst you could categorise these participants into these positions, when you started looking at their perceptions of what active neighbourhoods were and what they were thinking of them, you actually saw that there were a lot of commonalities, for example, between people who were supportive and unsupportive of active neighbourhoods, and the kind of the intricacies of these views were not as polarised as those propagated in media and on social media. These are some of the media headlines, for example, particularly focused on low traffic neighbourhoods, where they're talking about division, battles and wars, and bitter rows. So what we found really interesting in the active neighbourhood participants, especially with these positions in terms of supportive and unsupportive and ambivalent, is that people who were walking solely for their local journeys, they were generally unsupportive in our participant group. They were generally unsupportive or ambivalent towards the active neighbourhoods, but participants who walked and cycled were generally much more supportive. And this is really significant because if people who are already travelling actively by walking aren't supportive of active neighbourhoods, this is problematic, considering that the aims of active neighbourhoods are to create an environment where it's safer and nicer to walk as well as cycle. So looking into this more, we're looking at the perceived beneficiaries of active neighbourhoods. And when you're talking with people who are unsupportive and ambivalent towards active neighbourhoods, but were walking as their primary mode of transport, it's the infrastructures, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Partly, although comms material was part of it, so we had participants who said they received the comms material for their active neighbourhood, they looked it over and they didn't get involved because they thought it was a cycling intervention and it didn't have anything to do with them. But by far the most significant source of the perception within our participants, but also remembering that we had to use social media to recruit a lot of our participants, so there is a bit of a bias there, is that they were using social media to understand what the active neighbourhoods were, and they were finding out a lot of their information from people that they considered as cyclists. And these people that they considered cyclists were generally people who had Twitter or Facebook accounts, and would have themselves and their bike as their profile picture. So whilst people who cycle will also walk within these perceptions of who was providing the information, they were cyclists. Another part is that many activists around healthy active travel and cycling will already have networks, so through Twitter, through different organisations, and that they have the information that travels really quickly. And there was a perception then that people that were involved in these organisations and within cycling activism, for example, had a leg up basically within participation and influence on active neighbourhood processes, because they already understood the bureaucratic processes involved. And also, I think in social media posts, we often see this reference to the cycle lobby, and that came out as well. But also, references to the cycle lobby weren't always negative. Sometimes they were quite, so in this quote, you can see they're ferocious and all credit to them. We pedestrians don't speak up often enough. And there was quite a few similar kind of reflections that actually calling them a lobby, but recognising that they're working towards a safer environment, even if the perception is that it's a safer environment for cycling only, which is not necessarily the case. And the impact of this, that it delayed people's involvement if they thought it was a cycling intervention, not a walking and cycling intervention, or that people didn't see active neighbourhoods to represent their own active travel needs and therefore didn't support them. Another aspect of this perception is that one of the main infrastructures of active neighbourhoods as they stand are the use of modal filters. So I think most people here will know what a modal filter is, but just to say that it's a way to enable people walking and cycling using wheelchairs and mobility aids to access streets, but preventing through traffic going through them. But everybody in a car can still access their home, for example, but it might be a more circuitous route. The aim is to make these streets quieter and safer for walking. But the pavements remain an important infrastructure for walking. Many blind and visually impaired people are taught to navigate using curbs. Older people in the older person reference groups also still want the pavements, even if there's not as many cars going on the road. They don't want to walk in the road necessarily, because when there is a car, they have to keep moving out of the way. And parents with younger children were also saying they still wanted the pavements because it's they were worried about teaching a child that in one context it's okay to walk on the road, in another context it's not okay. But there was a feeling that the issues that they experienced in terms of pavements were not being resolved through active neighbourhoods. So pavement parking, the pavement condition. I had older people who were talking about, you know, they can't even go to the local shop because their husband can't go in their wheelchair because there's not enough curb drops. So a few older women were saying that they're so sick of walking around their local neighbourhood looking at the ground to see what the pavement condition is like because they've had injuries from tripping over. So you've got people that are literally stuck inside their home because they cannot actively, via walking, access their local neighbourhood, and don't see how modal filters will improve that access. Another aspect is the perceived inequalities embedded within the use of modal filters. So one of them, and this is the one that probably everyone knows from social media, is boundary roads and area inequality concerns. This is a legitimate concern, and processes of monitoring have a role in this. So this is an aspect of our report that we won't go into today, but it was really interesting. So this, within our 4 active neighbourhoods at the time of research, it only emerged as a concern within Levenshulme. And in fact, the complete opposite emerged within Garside Hay Road LTN, which is in Bury, where kind of in opposition, so in Levenshulme, there's the consideration that it's creating these middle-class enclaves on of nice small roads, whilst boundary roads have to absorb traffic and increase air pollution. Whether or not that's true or not remains to be seen. But in Garside Hay Road LTN, there's the perception that the filters are being implemented because it's got a high proportion of social housing, and it's a way of creating enclaves of social housing, keeping working class people away from other people, and that people saw it as highly stigmatizing to have these wooden filters on the road, and they considered that they were an area where this intervention could be placed because of this. So it's completely the opposite situation, and then that diversity of perceptions on inequality is based on these wider characteristics of what's happening in the area, and to only think about the boundary roads and area inequality when you're intervening in areas using active neighbourhoods will miss these other perceptions and opposition to active neighbourhoods. But the concern in Levenshulme over the boundary roads and area inequality concerns is also a really interesting one. and it shows this nuance of positions, is that actually everybody within, all of the participants within Levenshulme, for example, whether they supported or didn't support the active neighbourhoods or were ambivalent, had concerns about boundary roads and area inequality. And it kind of, there was this tendency for those who were unsupportive saw active neighbourhoods as this solo intervention, whereas those who were more supportive saw it as this one small step in a larger sequence. And actually, in reality, active neighbourhoods are such a tiny step to them in what needs to be done in order to kind of, to reduce overall car use. And another aspect that came out was the impact on disabled people. So within our walk-alongs, we had 3 disabled participants, and then the focus groups with older people. So in general, there's a really positive view on the potential of active neighbourhoods amongst older people, especially because the local area is the easiest place to access for exercise and to socialise, and that it's a really positive experience if you can go outside and use your feet and have a nice place to walk. Obviously, we've already talked about the walking infrastructure, but an issue that came up was of time tax. So modal filters are based on time tax, which is that by making journeys more circuitous, you ensure that short car journeys are undesirable. But you have to remember that time tax intersects with people's already existing time taxes, which for disabled people are often very significant. So in terms of self-care, doctor's appointments, hospital appointments, all of these different administrative and bureaucratic tasks that non-disabled people don't have to manage in their everyday lives. So one of my participants was really, really distressed at the potential of this impact on her life when she's only just managing, and already the idea of having more time in the car, which also exacerbates her health problems, was really concerning. But also that this time tax won't impact disabled residents uniformly. So another one of my participants was really supportive of the active neighbourhood and modal filters, but she was able to absorb the impact because she worked from home all of the time. So these have just been some kind of extracts coming out of our report. So just some concluding points about the evidence that there is this evidence that active neighbourhoods make active travel more attractive and enjoyable, but the positions on active neighbourhoods is much more nuanced and propagated online, and we need to start thinking about these nuances, the different perceptions of how people are engaging online with each other, and think about these lived concerns and take them seriously and sensitively. And that's where we're at. So there's my email, and if you want me to make sure that you get a copy of that report, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Tom, have any questions come through in the chat?
Yes, so there's one question that's just come through now. Just asking around how representative was the consultation with residents in the active neighbourhoods, and were there any biases?
Which consultation?
I'm very sorry, I'm not sure which one the question is referring to. It's from Eric Thomason from the University of Leeds. So if you have further clarifications, Eric, please put them in the chat.
Yeah, only because there's been a lot of consultations, and the consultations on each active neighbourhood have multiple consultations, so it's difficult to kind of, give an answer for that.
I think, because I had a similar sort of thought and question, because we're undertaking some research at the moment on transport-related social exclusion, which is, I guess, in kind of the same area, and we've been thinking as well about the representation. So I guess it's, obviously you have done a lot of consultations, but it's understanding, I suppose, how representative it is. I appreciate that it's very difficult to be fully representative, and in some ways you do want to maybe not always be representative because you want to over speak to certain groups. So I guess has there been any analysis, I guess, of the consultations that you've completed, the people that you've spoken to, and a comparison with the general population, the general demographics of the areas that you've looked at?
Yeah, so I think this is the thing about qualitative research, isn't it? That we're not seeking to be statistically representative, and we're not a consultation either. So what we have done is we've sought to ensure that we represent different groups, and also our participant recruitment process has been iterative. So we were looking at who's missing within our groups. So ensuring disabled people are represented and older people were represented were particularly important, as well as people of colour, and going for our processes and trying to change our processes of recruitment over time. But because it's qualitative and we want to understand the diversity of experiences rather than ensuring that we statistically represented the residents.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, and it's a shame that Tom, who's leading that work on the transport-related social exclusion, isn't joining us today. But I'll pass his details on to you, because I think that's a really important insight and a really important point to make. Tom, are there any further questions in the chat?
Yeah, so I'll just couple two up here because they kind of link onto each other. So there's one around sort of whether those who were walking didn't support the interventions because they thought the funds were going towards just improving conditions for cyclists and kind of felt left out. And then I guess on a related point, does the name have an important role in that and sort of overcoming that barrier to make people feel a bit more included?
Yes, I think there was a definite perception that they were cycling interventions. I mean, the extent of that is very difficult to kind of quantify, because they do improve walking, but I think it needs to reflect that they improve the walking conditions for particular groups. And if you need to use the pavement, for example, there is not necessarily improvements in your walking condition if you put modal filters in. I think that the use of active neighbourhoods is a good idea. I think that if you use low traffic neighbourhoods, it reduces it down to only looking at the traffic, but in turn that also creates this kind of cycle of only focusing on the quantitative analysis. So you see that residents keep asking for pollution monitoring, car numbers, and they want quantification, but also what about experiences of people in the areas, because it's also about placemaking and being. But the problem with this is that because low traffic neighbourhoods and LTNs has become such a pervasive term, then we see this kind of overlap, and it's very difficult now that's become such a dominant term to kind of move away from that. So, and I think it's really interesting when you look at the social media posts on active neighbourhoods in Greater Manchester, that when people are talking about the intervention itself in Greater Manchester, they will use active neighbourhoods as kind of a name for them. But if they're discussing them more widely, they'll use LTN or low traffic neighbourhood. So it's kind of, we're not quite there yet, but I do think active neighbourhood, it also moves away from the infrastructures as well, because there's so much more to kind of having healthy, active local areas than just putting in modal filters.
Thank you. Tom, were there any further questions? I know there's a question that's come through in this chat, which I think is separate to the wider chat.
Yes, it is, and it's from Martin Lucas Smith, who I think, Martin, you're able to ask the question over a microphone if you like.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me. So my question was there any use of people who already live in historic LTNs to get their lived experience that can then be passed on? So, for instance, I live in one that was created in the 1980s, and I've never met a single person who would have the filters removed. But of course, people have obviously moved into the area in the knowledge that they're there. But I wonder whether, you know, that experience of people who know what they're actually like is a way to actually help those who are sort of potentially going into one, as it were.
No, it wasn't. But so it's in partnership with TFGM, and we kind of have regular catch-up meetings. And this was mentioned before, that it would be an interesting aspect, because there's also been some community mapping within Greater Manchester showing how many existing LTNs there are already, and even cul-de-sacs. So yeah, that in some areas you also saw that residents in cul-de-sacs were against this kind of this wider active neighbourhood that would give similar conditions to their neighbours. So yeah, we have been thinking, and we're hopefully extending the research a bit. So whether that can be integrated into a next stage would be really interesting.
That's really fascinating, because I've never really thought of a cul-de-sac as in this sort of way. But yeah, I grew up sort of on the edge of a cul-de-sac, and it was always very quiet and quite safe for us to play out on our bikes. I've never thought of it in that context before. But yeah, that's really interesting. Tom, are there any further questions, or should we move on to the next speaker?
Yeah, there's a couple, but I'll forward them on to Harriet offline to pick up after the call. If you like. So yeah, I think we can move on to the next speaker.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much,
Harriet.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Martin Lucas Smith, who has just asked a question. So that was good timing. He's a developer and director at CycleStreets, and he will be discussing mapping modal filters and low traffic neighbourhoods.
Hello everyone. Can I just check that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, yeah, I
Great.
can see that.
So I'm going to speak on mapping low traffic neighbourhoods. Just to firstly give a brief introduction about myself and CycleStreets. We're a social enterprise based in Cambridge, down south, although my family's half northern and I've lived in Lincoln for a year. But we're best known for doing journey planning, so sort of getting best routes from A to B. And if you used websites such as the Propensity to Cycle tool or SIPT, or apps like CityMapper, for example, you'll have used our work. We also do lots of work to create various tools for advocacy, such as getting collision data and so on much more accessible, working on planning application data and other things. And we're also experts in OpenStreetMap. And I'm one of two people who've been working on a project for low traffic neighbourhoods, myself and my colleague Simon, who isn't, I don't think, with us today, but will. So I'll go on to this. So modal filters and LTN. So the first thing to say is really there's no actual national data on where they are, surprisingly. When you look at maps, what you see are the, if you like, the physical layouts of streets, but there's nothing that sort of says here is a modal filter. So we see things like where you have a main road that's been sort of detached, and the side roads coming off it has been detached. That's not shown as a modal filter. It's just basically a side road with a little sort of walkway between it. What we also know is that modal filters and LTNs are not actually radical or new. They've existed for many decades. And so it's been quite interesting over the last year to see the debate about them, particularly as someone, as I say, who has actually lived in one that was created 40 years ago. So we wanted to demonstrate that they're very common, to help really inform that debate, and in particular to help people creating new LTNs, to show that actually these are very common, and that many people already exist in them. And as you say, for things like cul-de-sacs, but also if you consider things like council estates, they're often sort of 1960s, 70s council estates that with blocks of flats and so on. They're often LTNs because you can drive in and out, but you can't actually drive through. We also wanted to make available the data that we've done, our research, for further research, particularly on things like socio-economic correlations, which has clearly been a subject of significant debate. So we set out to map for the first time two things. Firstly, where modal filters are, the various different types, which I'll just go through in a second. And secondly, which streets are through streets. So that's saying which streets are potentially usable in terms of rat running and people just passing through, versus those which are stopped because of modal filters. We do actually have a live map that you can use. I should say this work is all what we call beta, so it's not completely finished, but it's usable for checking and validation at this stage. But I'll talk about that later. So first of all, let me talk a bit about where modal filters actually are. This is just an example from Newcastle, and it shows the locations of various modal filters based on mapping data. As I say, this is a beta, so that there may be some errors, but and you can see on the left-hand side there we have a key which explains the different types. So there are various things such as bollards, gates, which are obviously not particularly common so much in town centres, gaps where you have some sort of residential street but with a gap in the middle that's only usable by people walking and cycling. and wheeling. You have cycleway filters, so things like no entry except cycles, which stop traffic going into an area, and also bus gates. So let's just have a look at those each first, just before we look at a bit more data. So here's a classic case. Some of these are actually from Cambridge, where I live, which actually demonstrates again that these are quite sort of common. So here's the typical sort of bollards arrangement. This is probably a little bit over the top, but lots of bollards that basically essentially stop traffic going from one side of one bit of a street to another. We have gates. So this is from the 1980s. As you can see here, it basically prevents people driving through, but there is actually emergency access. So you can just about see there are some handles which can be lifted, but it allows people to walk, wheel and cycle through without any difficulty. Gaps, very similar sort of thing. So this is where there is some sort of gap has been made just by essentially punching a hole through something, or adding some sort of sets of a wall or something like that. Obviously, these are very similar to the first two, but they're often represented in mapping data as just a line rather than a bollard as such. Here's another example. This is one that's obviously combined with bollard, but again, it's just, you can see this is some sort of crossroads through a residential area, and this sort of arrangement in the middle has been added together with some trees and so on to brighten up the street. And then we have cycleway filters. So this is the traditional sort of pre-2010 arrangement, where you have a cycleway that's a no entry except cycles arrangement. So you can see there, you've got on the left, well, we've got a no entry, we've got standard no entry signs, but then we have an exemption on the side there, where a little plug where people can cycle through. And here's another example. This actually doesn't have any physical measures there. This uses the post-2010 arrangement, where you can actually just put an exempt cycles plate and people can just cycle in. And we would definitely regard this as a modal filter. It allows people it allows cyclists obviously to go in, but it really stops traffic coming into the area. And often these are obviously done in combination to sort of strategically set a whole area to be perhaps another combination with bollards and so on to stop traffic within a zone, as it were. And then we have bus gates, which are again another type of modal filter. They obviously stop particularly into city centres, people driving in, increasingly obviously in camera enforced, although this one I think you can just about see used to use some physical bollards in the middle of the street there. And this one allows cycling, buses and taxis in this case. So there are many different types of filters, and again, these are all represented quite differently in terms of mapping. There's another type, which is what we've called continuations. We didn't actually have a sort of a formal name for these. So this is from South Shields, my holiday location last year. And you can see here what we've got is a main road, which is along left to right. And there are basically lots of side streets all like this, where essentially the side street has been cut off from the main road in terms of driving by use of some kind of bollards. So this sort of continuation has been, there's a sort of continuation here, which is essentially a bit of walkway that you can walk, or in this case, I believe you can technically cycle over. And here they actually used a rather nice sort of art feature relating to that. This is a coastal area to stop that. And continuations are actually very common, I think, on a lot of main roads. But perhaps we don't think of them as modal filters because they've been there for so long. Sometimes there are bus stops that are added, things like that in front of them. Here's another example of continuation. This is from the 1980s, a very grotty kind of case. Quite a grotty picture, I'm afraid, but you can see there that the local authority had put in some sort of gate, and you can sort of walk round across to get to the main road, but you can't drive through. Here's a more modern example of a continuation. This has been essentially a streetscape scheme as well, and again, it has the same principle of stopping traffic joining the main road. It's just behind the photographer. So what we've done is to analyse map data, the street patterns, if you like, and to produce maps of where these are. These are just some quick examples. We'll have a look at the real data in a second. But here's Newcastle, for example. Particularly this area, you get a lot of these continuations along the main road. But there are modal filters all over the place. And of course, these really reflect a lot of historical work over many decades that perhaps has never been sort of badged under the term of what we now call low traffic neighbourhoods, but perhaps was responded to particular historic concerns about traffic. This is from Sheffield, for example. Here's from Lincoln, where I used to live. It's obviously a smaller city than the likes of, say, Newcastle, Sheffield, but nonetheless, you have some dotted about. Liverpool, which seems to have quite a large number actually comparatively, interestingly, and so on. So how does it work? As I say, there's no actual data saying here is a modal filter, it's just street patterns. So what we've done is to define these various street patterns that we just looked at. So for example, a continuation is a main road with a sort of walkway and then continuing as a residential street. And what we've done is to convert each of these cases into a diagram that is very sort of simplified points and lines that essentially sets out the pattern for how these are. And we've then tried to express that diagram in a form of database code, which I won't bore you with, but and we then search the map for all of these cases. And I will just give you a quick example. So don't worry about the code here, but this is the no entry except cycles case that we're looking before. So this is where we have the main road, and we have the plug, and then this residential street. And if we look at the diagram here, which represents this, we can see here along the bottom to the top is the main road. And then there's a little star here, which represents this junction here. And coming out from the junction, there is the residential street, which is this side road. And you can see here that on the side road, there is essentially a one-way section. So that's the bit where people drive in towards the main road. So we've got this one way, and then there is this kind of bypass that goes around it. And so we have this pattern, which is represented by the fact you have a main road joined to a side road at a certain point, and at that same point you have a plug coming off it, and additionally a constraint that this has to be one way, because that indicates that it's a no entry. And we can basically represent all these sort of joinings of bits of lines and points and so on as this database code, and I won't obviously explain what that is, but you can see it's quite a complex sort of pattern matching exercise, and we've had to do that with all these different types of interventions, and there's a long running tail of ever more inventive ways of stopping traffic that we've had to work through. But the result is that we end up with a map of where these are. And we're now in the process of getting feedback where people can say that we've mismarked ones or that ones are missing. Often these are sometimes due to map data. Can I just check everyone can hear me okay still? Ooh.
Yeah.
Yep, great.
Yep.
Ooh, sorry, just want to check because I can't obviously see the scene. So we'll have a look at that in a sec. And the next thing that we've done, though, is to look at potential rat running through streets. So whether a street is one way or not. Sorry, whether it's through traffic or not. Now, this is actually an example from Cambridge, where I live. We actually focused although the map is UK wide, and the north in particular has got plenty of modal filters, we felt that Cambridge was a good actual test case point, for a start, because we live here and we're very familiar with it, but also because the map data that we're using is known to be a very high standard, and so we could therefore ensure the purity of our model against the map quality, against the map data. So this is the area, in fact, which I live, and you can see here it's surrounded by these sort of main streets, and there are these, in particular, these main two modal filters here. And if we look at this in terms of the separate analysis we've done in terms of through traffic, what we end up finding is that this whole area has been calmed of traffic and that you can't drive through it. So we have streets that you can drive through. So here along the top is a sort of red area which does allow through traffic, but the rest of it is this greeny blue, which is no through traffic, and that's because of these two strategically placed modal filters, which have the effect, even quite many streets away, of stopping people driving through from one side to the other. So I'll explain a bit how about this works now. So this is actually just an example from Lincoln, which, as you can see, has quite a large number of areas that are no through. Those are in many cases because of cul-de-sacs. So you can see here, obviously, you have a sort of dead end, but you do have areas where there are basically the through traffic is stopped. But in other areas, you can see there are potentially a lot of sort of leakages between main roads. That's not to say that through traffic is happening in terms of rat running. It's just to say it's possible. There obviously isn't data on where it is definitely happening. And one of the things that we're doing on this analysis, the streets analysis, is adding more heuristics about where people are likely to rat run based on the delay equivalent that they would get if they were using the main road. So again, let's just go into this a little bit more detail. So this, as I say, is the area I was just looking at. You can see there's large numbers of green areas and relatively small amounts of through areas. So I've got here 5 sort of pictures that really demonstrate how we've been doing this. And if we look at the first one, the first thing we do is we divide up a city into the sort of natural edges, if you like, of a neighbourhood, which are the main roads. So you can see here we have this main road here, and there's one along there, and along here. And then we also have a railway going through, which obviously is a formal barrier that you can't cross unless there's a bridge. But also there's rivers and so on. So here's a river. And so you can see we end up with these sort of polygons that really, you know, people think of, I suppose, as the area that they live, which are surrounded by these main roads. And so if we now enumerate those main roads, you can see here this one is Mill Road. We have East Road, Newmarket Road, Coldham's Lane, and the railway. So these sort of 5 sides of the polygon. And we define rat running really as going from one main road to another through a residential street. Now, that slightly fails where you have a very, very long main road where people actually jump from sort of, you know, where it sort of curves round and perhaps people jump across. But we'll talk about that on later, perhaps. But you can see here, for example, on Mill Road, there are actually 9 entry points. But in all cases, you can only get from one entry point to another. You can only really drive in and out, which is essentially what a low traffic neighbourhood is. And so, for example, 1, 2, 3 here, these sort of form a little clump of streets that you can drive between, but there's no way you can get from Mill Road to any of these others. So what we're really testing is to say, can you get from any of these 5 main roads to another one by driving through? And it turns out in this area that the only combination that you can get, so, you know, we could try 1 to 10, no, it's not possible, 1 to 11, 1 to 12, and so on. The only combination you can get is actually between 13 and 16, which has this through traffic area. And there's then it's almost like a mini gyratory because these are actually one-way streets. So there's also 16 to 13, and there's also the ability to get from 13 to 12, which is obviously one of these cases where it's probably unlikely that people would sort of come off the main road and then go back because it's such a short distance. And so we can then capture all those streets that have been travelled on by cars. So we essentially wrote a mini routing engine for cars, and you can see the results here that only these bits have been captured. And then what we do is we colour those captured the runnable roads red, and everything else green. But we also then look at whether those streets that have got through traffic have got traffic calming. So you can possibly just about see at the top of this diagram 5 that there is a section which is slightly a sort of more browny red, and that's actually an area that's traffic calming. And it is quite interesting. You do see sometimes where you have these sort of LTN areas, but there are bits left out. That traffic calming has been the sort of solution halfway. And I know in London there are areas where there has been traffic calming, but the growth of sat-navs has meant that now that's become an inadequate intervention. So this is broadly how it works, and then we add various heuristics to stop very long, unrealistic sort of rat runs where people go from one main route to another, but it would be very long distance rounds and so on. But there's more work that we're doing in that area. So just before I show you the live map, just to give an example and to give you access yourselves, just to say a bit about the data. So the data we're using comes from OpenStreetMap, which is the best data available for things like where there's actually cycling data and walking. The analysis covers all of the UK and Ireland, and it's updated on a daily basis. So if we make a fix to the data, we would normally see that within a day or two after. There's an online map, which we'll look at in a moment. There's also a public data interface called an API, which enables programmers and web developers and indeed GIS people to embed that data into their own systems. But we are actually downloading full-scale GIS downloads by city and area. And we also plan to produce statistics by city and ward, because we think potentially there could be scope for perhaps councillors between areas to play off each other about, you know, how much their areas have been traffic calmed. There's been some initial media coverage earlier in the summer. You might have seen this article in The Guardian, which has found that there are an awful lot of these all over the place already. But the next step's really so we're now in a beta stage. We're now really seeking feedback from officers and practitioners and groups and so on our research that we've done so far. And we're also seeking funding to develop it more. But we're also working to add more complicated street patterns that form modal filters, but are not perhaps that are expressed in a more complicated way on the map, or that on the ground are more complicated. And also to develop the streets analysis, the through traffic analysis, to have more heuristics about where people are likely to cut through. And we hope that this work will prove that the research will show that these are actually widespread. We hope this will back up infrastructure work that many of you are doing. And we also hope that this will provide an evidence base that can then be linked with other evidence bases such as socio-demographic data. For example, to answer the question, is it more likely that people who are rich live in these areas, or in fact, is it broader? And my suspicion is that it's probably much broader, because you do see a lot of council estates and so on that are historic, essentially LTNs, but they're not thought of in that way as not having through traffic. We also believe that this could actually improve the quality of cycle routing. So we, for our routing engine, for example, we would know that some areas are that are more likely to have through traffic than others. So let's have a quick look at the map. Let me just firstly put in the chat the password. I don't know if apparently this is a different chat to the one I'm in, so perhaps someone could forward it on. But let me just got a few minutes, and I'll go to questions. So as you see, this is a UK-wide map. It'll only show 2,000 streets. 2,000 locations at any one time, just to avoid the browser being slow, because obviously there's so many. You can see here we have various, there are various layers here. So we have the modal filters layer, and then we have the LTNs layer, which we'll look at in a moment, and then OpenStreetMap data. So there's a reference data set that we can ignore for the purposes of this talk. Let's, for example, just have a quick look at another city. So here, for example, is Newcastle, probably my favourite city in the UK. And yeah, so here, let's just look over this area. So you can see here, we've got many of these. If we look very closely in at the map, you can see here we've got a main street with a side street and then a continuation. And let's just have a look at this one. So we can see, yeah, so you can see there, this is clearly a historic street that's been cut off. I hope everyone can see the street view embedded there. Now, occasionally this will find, sometimes the data will mismatch things that are actually really just very narrow sort of paths joining an estate. So there is actually a button where people can give feedback that's saying it's not a modal filter, or indeed you can actually right click on an area to say that you can actually right click and say that we've actually missed something out. We believe at the moment the analysis is getting to about 80 to 90% accuracy, and we're busy working on remaining bugs that have come through from feedback. We've had hundreds and hundreds of bits of feedback, which we've been working through, and it's coming up with some very useful feedback. So here's Libertune that we were just talking about, so lots of modal filters all over the place. And if I switch on the streets layer, you can see there that, well, certainly this area is. Interestingly, there's clearly some are being stopped, but there's clearly some areas that have got some leakage between areas, and that may be perhaps because the intervention actually doesn't cover particular streets, or it may be that the map data needs to be updated in some way. But you can see the fact that you get these sort of areas that are very heavily LTNs, and then others that are less so. Here's an example from Lincoln. So let's just go to, let's say this one. So yes, here that looks like a classic sort of LTN. You've got two main roads, and there's some sort of modal filter here. Let's just see what that is. Yeah, so you can see there's some bollards that we put through, and that's essentially created that space for walking and cycling through. So I hope someone's been able to just forward on the details in the chat to give you access. We very much welcome any feedback. It's a live map. It's being updated daily automatically. And perhaps we could go on to some questions now. I think we've got 5 minutes.
Wow, thank you very much. That's incredibly detailed, and the fact that there's also pictures to accompany these LTNs as well is amazing. I'm just thinking, I know our partners at Transport for the North, we have partners across the North at the transport authorities. I'm sure they will find this endlessly useful, so we'll make sure that it goes out to our partners, and I'm sure we can send out an email with the link and also the password to access this, because like I say, I'm sure our partners will be more than happy to give feedback, particularly if they know the areas very well, and like you say, if they are, have their own local areas, or they've worked on specific LTNs, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to pass that information on. I just had a thought when you said about linking to other data sets. Something that we have done at TFN is look at land value uplift and housing costs across the north. So yeah. I had an immediate thought about where you showed those orange lines with the kind of rat runs. Does that potentially reduce the housing value? I know you said about the socio-demographic population and how it impacts that. I think understanding potential impact on house prices and quality of housing also pollution and air quality, things like that. Would be really interesting to layer this over the top. Yeah, really valuable data set here. And I'll make sure that our TAME colleagues, so the analytical and the modelling team, are aware of this and have seen it. Tom, are there any questions in the chat that you'd like to pose to Martin?
Yeah, we've had a few, so I'll pair a couple up if you like. We've got one from James Armstrong, who has actually since said that he's managed to log onto the map and he's really impressed by it. So
thank you.
Yeah, great work. Yeah, James asks whether you've mapped anywhere in the Netherlands or anywhere else to sort of compare and see if there are any lessons to be learned from that.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. We absolutely have the capability to do that. We've simply just limited it to the UK and Ireland just for the fact that this takes a few hours to run overnight, and we're obviously keen to get an analysis as good as possible in the UK. But our routing engine, for example, does actually cover most of Northern Europe, so we've got all the data loaded. There's absolutely no reason the same analysis won't work the rest of the world. It's looking at patterns which are obviously very common elsewhere. So yes, I'll take that forward. Netherlands might be a good one to add in, at an early stage. I think, of course, the Netherlands does have really the concept of a third network alongside the road and path network of a cycle network, which may mean that actually motor filters may not perhaps be quite so prevalent in the sense that they're not necessarily so much needed for cycling, although they may be much more for for streetscape reasons. But yes, I'll definitely take that forwards and see if we can enable the Netherlands as an early area. It's a very good point.
Excellent, thank you. And then there's a couple of questions on rat running as well. So somebody's asked what classifies road as a main road, and then just to follow on from that as well, whether there's a risk of modal filters leading people to becoming lost in the maze, trying to find a through route and just causing congestion while rat running.
So main roads, what we define them as basically, well, in OpenStreetMap they're sort of primary or secondary. So basically A roads and B roads upwards. There are some cases where C roads do form what would be considered as main roads, and that's something that we do want to develop the analysis a bit more forward. I would say in general the motor filters analysis is definitely at a further level of the research compared to the streets one, which is a little bit more needs quite a bit more work, I think, to get a really robust output. And C roads are exactly the kind of case where we want to look next. We know, for example, in Ireland, in Dublin, for example, there's a really key motor filter been added on a C road. And in fact, near where I live, we had an experimental scheme over last year, which was a C road, and which made significant differences to the whole area, but obviously would be picked up as a modal filter, but not as in terms of our streets analysis. So I think, yeah, I think we've broadly found that the categorization that we got is correct, but again, any feedback would be welcome in particular areas. We obviously need to make sure the analysis runs on a relatively generic way across the whole country, but we do have the ability to make exceptions and where there are particular cases. And I think what we'll probably be doing is looking where modal filters exist on main roads and treating and downgrading them to be considered as local streets for the purposes of the analysis. Sorry, what was the second? Oh yes, about sort of would people sort of try to avoid the modal filters? I think the fact is that people driving through will basically be increasingly just using sat navs, and that's really the source of many of the problems that we've seen in the last 10 years with these. Why modal filters have suddenly become much more necessary. I'm not very convinced that a map like this would be something that a driver would then use, although it's possible. We really see this much more as something that is most likely to be used for advocacy. But nonetheless, I mean, the fact that people can drive through, is just essentially going to become public data, and but I think that sat navs are really doing that job for us already on a far more wide scale than an advocacy map from an active travel body is likely to achieve.
Thank you, Tom. Are there any further questions? We've got a couple more minutes just before we take a short break.
Yep, one's just come through now, asking whether you're developing your pattern matching algorithms to identify other features for other purposes, such as road safety, or to identify map defects that we need enhancing for autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, so the analysis that we're doing the LTNs and motor filters is a very specific area analysis. But we do actually have another website called Bike Data, which includes, for example, our cyclability ratings layer, which essentially rates every street for cyclability, and that's what our internal journey planner uses. So, and there are various other data sets that we're providing, such as planning applications across the UK, all sorts of things. So it'd be worth having a look at this site, which is CycleStreets Bike Data. But yeah, I think there's many areas that we'd love to work on. One of the things that's come up is that often when you look at this map, you think, gosh, these are great areas for cycling. But actually, what this isn't, it is not a map of permeability. And so you can often have, obviously, what you might think of as LTNs in terms of historic ones, where they're essentially sort of Barratt Homes estates kind of thing, where they're just sort of spewed across the countryside with dead ends everywhere, coming up green, because they are actually not through streets. But they're not. That is not the same thing as to say that they are permeable for walking and cycling. So there would certainly be value in being able to do that kind of analysis. But I mean, we're quite a small organisation with quite limited resources, so that's not something that we've considered doing yet. But if someone were to commission that, we'd be quite happy to look at that kind of analysis. But yeah, I think the approach that we're taking here of actually analysing street patterns, there's a lot that could be done in all kinds of areas, but it is quite arduous and advanced work. So, but yes, I'd love to hear any suggestions to you, Cloud. Do contact us. Our email address is info@cyclestreets.net, or just search the web and you'll find us quite easily.
Super. And yeah, I think that point's really interesting, because that's something that we've talked about Transport for the North as well, is housing estates that don't have cut-throughs for people on foot. So there may be one way in for cars and one way out, but if you're right at the back of a housing estate, it's going to take you 10 minutes to walk all the way through the maze of streets, because there's just been no cut-throughs put in, whereas traditionally you may have had cut-throughs onto other roads, so it can lead to quite a long diversion. I think Harriet covered that a bit in her presentation as well. Thank you very much for that presentation, and like I say, we'll send the links through to people after this event. We're going to take a short break until 1 o'clock, so we're just going to stop for 4 minutes, and then we'll have the next speaker, who will be Dr. Caroline Mullen. So if you'd just like to have a short break till 1, we'll restart at 1 o'clock.